Hey everybody, well, some familiar names. Welcome to this event. We'll be talking with Paola Mendoza about her book Sanctuary. Please feel free to add comments in the chat panel, which you can access by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop. And if you're on your iPad, I think there's a little panel in like the upper corner. Um, if you have questions, please click the Q&A button and put questions there so that the questions don't get lost in the chat. We'll have a question and answer Q&A section a little bit later. That also should be at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop. Alrighty, so just a little bit about Word Up. Word Up Community Bookshop is a bookshop and art space run by local residents, many of whom are volunteers. We can be found at 2113 Amsterdam Avenue at the corner of 165th Street in Washington Heights. And we host events for all ages and sell used and new books in English and Spanish in that space, but you can check us out at www.wordupbooks.com to place orders. Right now, we're not open for pickup, and you can also, on Tuesdays, I think we have one more session where we're working with Gail Brewer, the borough president of Manhattan, in her office to have COVID-19 self-testing. So next Tuesday, February 9th, check that out. And because also we're not open for public browsing at this time, we started a Gofundme campaign to maintain our space and meet our obligations while closed. Just drop that link in the chat for people to check out. We do lots of different kinds of programming, including Lomas Lit, which is our youth book club, which Sanctuary was the January pick for. And so we're really, really excited to have Paola here with us today. It's unfortunate Abby won't be able to join us, but she will be with us in spirit. And of course, we'll be discussing the work that they co-authored. It's really great to see some of our Lomas Lit members in the audience with us today. And one of our co-facilitators is really great. So I wanted to say a little bit about Abby, who won't be able to make it before I introduce Paola, just to give some context, because I think she'll be coming up today. Abby Sher is an award-winning writer and performer. She's the author of Miss You, Love You, Hate You, By All the Ways the World Can End, Breaking Free, Amen, 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 Memoir of a Girl Who Couldn't Stop Praying, and Kissing Snowflakes. Abby has written and or performed for the New York Times, The New Yorker, The Second City, Upright Citizens Brigade, HBO, and NPR. Writing Sanctuary with Paola Mendoza has been a dream come true. And Paola Mendoza is an author, film director, activist, and artist working at the leading edge of human rights. A co-founder of the Women's March, she served as its artistic director and co-authored the New York Times bestseller, Together We Rise, Behind the Scenes at the Protest Heard Around the World. Paola's film credits include the award-winning Entre Nos, Free Like the Birds, and Autumn's Eyes. So I'm going to stop talking now. You can see, thank you, Vern, for holding up Sanctuary, the book we'll be discussing. And I'm going to stop talking for a bit and let Paola introduce herself a little bit more before we get into discussing the book.
I can't wait for us to all be out of this pandemic and we no longer accidentally speak on mute, which happens like 10 times a day. First and foremost, thank you so much for inviting us to be here. Abby sends her condolences for not being able to be here, but hopefully maybe we'll do a second one and she can be here at the second one. We are thrilled to be able to talk about our book Sanctuary. I am thrilled to be able to talk about Sanctuary. It is a book that is near and dear to my heart. I have been working, if you hear my son, or if you hear screaming in the background, that's my son playing a video game. But I have been working in immigration, fighting for immigration reform for over a decade, for about 15 years. And I have been in the immigrant rights movement. My contribution to that movement has really been from the storytelling perspective, finding ways in which to tell the stories of undocumented immigrants here in the United States. I believe one of the many jobs of an artist is to expand the audience's heart that they're trying to reach, make them more compassionate, make their hearts more open to things that they might not have experienced or known of previously to encountering my artwork. So Sanctuary falls in line with that, in trying to tell the story of an undocumented 16-year-old girl in a very near future in the United States that looks different than the one that we are currently living in, but also the reader should be able to easily imagine how this world of Sanctuary in 2032 was created, and we arrived at this dystopian, authoritarian, futuristic, scary place that no one would want to be living in, undocumented particularly, but also just a regular human being with papers. So we can dig into this more, and there's so much to talk about with regards to immigration and where we are at that moment, this moment in this country with regards to immigration. But that's my son. But for now, I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Paula. Yeah, there's so much in this book, and it was really exciting and I think interesting. We read a couple of books together as a book club, and your book in particular sparked a lot of conversation, and I think opened up a lot of venues for talking about the world that we live in now. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between real life and fiction. And actually, we can go straight into that, and we can we can maybe come to some of the other points later. Yeah.
Yeah, so I always say off the top that Sanctuary, the character of Valley, the circumstances of Valley are not inspired by any one person that I've met along the way. At this point in my life, I've probably interviewed, spoken to over 1,000, maybe a couple of thousand undocumented immigrants about their personal stories. I have met people on the caravan. I have met people in detention centers. I have met families who recently were just separated when Trump implemented his zero tolerance policy of family separation. But not one story is inspired, that not one person inspired the story of Valley, but rather all of the stories that I've heard and all of the people that I've spoken to, they are woven into the fabric of Sanctuary. Moments and elements of people that I remember and that I've kept in my heart for so long are part of this book. So the book is very much steeped in reality, but it is also merged with imagination and fiction, obviously, as well as everything that is in the book from a policy standpoint, if we want to get so like heady in that way, is based on something that was currently, when we were writing it, we were writing in 2019, 2018, it was policies that were actually in place. And then we just kind of played those policies out towards the most evil aspects of them. And so that is all based in reality and just kind of progressed, evolved from where they are in 2008, 2018, 2019 to where they might be in 2032. So yes, so that is the reality of Sanctuary. And you know, it's oftentimes when we were writing, and Abby says this a lot, like we would be writing and we would be creating things and imagining things, and those things would then come to pass. And obviously not verbatim, but close enough parallels that were eerie and frightening. And that allowed us to know that we were on the right path in order to tell this story and create this world that we were basically saying, we do not want to be in this country like this. So we need to do something to stop this, because this book was written and published before 2020, came out before 2020. And we really wanted to be part of that national election and discourse around, that national discourse around the election.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because you've worked in film and you've done a lot of different kinds of storytelling and worked in different capacities. And I wonder what brought you to writing this YA story as that being part of your work.
Well, in 2018, when I got the idea of Sanctuary, there wasn't a tremendous amount of books that were about undocumented young people. There were some, of course, but there wasn't a lot. And having been working in this space and having been speaking to young people for so long about their stories, about what it meant to be undocumented, about the need for the need and the desire for people to understand who undocumented people were was so great. And I firmly believe, as an artist, as a woman of color, that representation matters. It matters tremendously. We have to see ourselves in TV, in movies, in books, in comic books, in games. Like, we physically have to see that we exist in this world, um, because it means that other people see us as well. It just, representation means so much. And so, realizing that there wasn't that many YA books that had undocumented people at their center, I felt that it was a responsibility to tell this story from that perspective. I myself am not undocumented. I am an immigrant, but I have never been undocumented. Uh, but I have spent so much time in this world, that I felt that I could tell this story authentically, responsibly, uh, with the um, with the sensitivity that it requires, um, in order to do it. Tell this story with what I hope is dignity and love and honor, and allowing our characters to be flawed, to not have to be these perfect immigrants, but allowing them to be three-dimensional human beings, which is what everyone is. And so I wanted to step into this challenge, though I was very nervous to step into the challenge, and I wanted it also to be YA because I wanted um, this discussion around immigration to begin earlier than where it was beginning. Like, I wanted those that aren't undocumented to realize that they might have undocumented friends in their school, community members in their school, and to really, again, expand that heart of that young person. The publisher says that this book is for 12 and up. I was surprised. I was like, whoa, that's real young, but we'll go with that. But I've had now lots of discussions with 12-year-olds about this book, and they're amazing and they're brilliant and they get it. And if we're able to have these really honest, truthful discussions with 12-year-olds, as well as with adults, and have that cross-generational discussion around immigration, then I think that will only benefit us, the movement, this country, immigrants in the future.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you bring up the sort of age, the bottom of the age range that they give, and these sorts of stories. And I remember, and I wonder what, the Ana Jaramillo, La Línea, that book.
I haven't read it, no. But I know about it.
I think it's, I might be getting her name right, but La Línea was the
Mhm.
book. And I remember reading that in middle school, and and thinking about the how we use these books. And it's interesting that you bring up the intergenerational piece of in the conversations that we have around immigration and these relevant topics. How have you used this book, and how do you further see this book being used and envision it being used, and what are some experiences you've had around that have um, that you feel should be used as examples? I'm asking as a programming person at a community organization that uses
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there are so many ways in which this book can be used. We've had discussions, Abby and I have had discussions. One of the most fascinating discussions with probably, I think it was from like 12 to 15-year-olds, um, It was a school in the middle of the country, pretty diverse, to be quite frank. I was surprised at the diversity around the school. And a lot of the conversation was just about the logistics and the ins and outs of immigration, how to immigrate to this country. What does a green card mean? What does a visa mean? What does it mean to be undocumented? You know, a young person used the I word in the conversation, and I had to talk about, like, we don't use that word, and this is the reason why. And so the breadth of the conversation was very much in the nuances of the semantics of immigrating to the United States. And no one had ever talked to these kids about that. And they really wanted to understand and engage in it, because I think once they understood that part of it, once all those like logistical, legal questions were out of the way, then they could analyze it from like a holistic perspective around, okay, this is how difficult and near impossible it is to get to this country this way. So yeah, people come this way, and how do I feel about this, and what can I do, and what can we do to resolve this problem? So I think those conversations are extremely important. I think also from a programming perspective, on the flip side, I will say, you know, I recently spoke to a group of older students, young people, really. They were like in their early 20s. And a lot of them were undocumented. And a lot of them spoke from the perspective of, they appreciated this book, they really liked this book, but it also was very triggering for them. It spoke to their fears of their entire life on a very visceral level, and it was very hard for them to get through this book, though they thought it was very important. And they were like, I'm sending it to all of my friends who aren't undocumented, so they can maybe get a perspective of what it means to be me, being undocumented in this country. So those two perspectives, I think that conversation from a programmatic standpoint is absolutely critical. And then we are entering, from a policy perspective, we're entering a moment that is extraordinarily important for immigration at this moment, because there's a possibility with this new administration, with Biden and Harris as our president and vice president, to actually get immigration reform. And what that means is that currently in this country, there are 11 million undocumented people living in this country. And we have been fighting for a pathway to citizenship for these 11 million people for decades. Right now, we're at a possible point where we could get the 11 million people on a pathway to citizenship. And so the more people understand what it means to be undocumented, having just come out of an administration that attacked undocumented people relentlessly, and that we could actually pass a law that can help all of these people, that conversation and books like this, and books that bring the humanity around this issue, are even more critical. You know, I don't think a lot of people realize that there are over 5 million undocumented essential workers in this country. And so what that means from a practical level is, the reason why we were able to eat and get chicken and meat on our plates during the pandemic was because undocumented workers were working in meat plants and chicken plants, and quite frankly, dying at unbelievable numbers, because the safety protocols in place at these meat plants, at these chicken processing plants, were horrific. And so that's 5 million of the 11 million undocumented people, right? That were working as essential frontline workers, many of whom have died. And so the question becomes, like, what do we as a country owe these people? We say that they are essential workers. So what do we as a country need to do in order to treat them as essential people, essential members of our community, essential members of our country? Because they clearly are. They allowed us to eat and function and have some sort of normalcy during the past 11 months. So from a programming standpoint, I think it's a very rich content. There, you could be creative. There's a new campaign out called Immigrants Are Essential that talks specifically about that, about getting all of these people on a pathway to citizenship.
Yeah, thank you. Um, so I'm gonna have us pivot just a little bit to talking about the co-authoring process and
Yeah.
bringing the story to life, and if you could talk a little bit more about that and what that was like. Yeah.
Yeah. So I say this when Abby's here and when Abby's not here. Working with Abby was one of the best collaborations that I've had. And I, as an artist, have collaborated basically my entire career. I love collaborating, and I think it makes me a better artist to collaborate with others. And Abby and our collaboration was extraordinary. Abby, previous to this, wasn't really, not at all. And she says it herself, she wasn't involved or didn't have that much knowledge around the ins and outs of immigration. Writing this book for her really allowed her to understand it on a deep personal emotional level, personal in the sense that she became so invested in it, because she really um, had a window into this character of Valley and the reality that she lived through and was living through in our book. Um, People always ask, like, how did you do it? What did you do? And so this was pre-COVID, so we were in the room often together. But also we live in different cities, not far from each other, but we live in different cities and we're both moms. So our time was also limited. Google Docs was our best friend. And we would do a lot of no, we didn't do Zoom at that point. We would just do a lot of like FaceTiming and a lot of work virtually. But we beat it out and had an outline that was very clear, that we worked on together, and we like understood everything that was happening, all of the actions, all of the characters, and then we would go and write. And essentially our strengths were, my strength was writing from the perspective of the larger story, of the plot, of really understanding where our characters were going and how to get them there. And Abby's strength was really the characters. And so that's kind of how our work just naturally divided. She was able to delve into those characters and truly understand those characters. And then because of my knowledge around immigration, that expertise came into play in all of the storytelling aspects and in the character work as well.
Yeah, and I think as an extension of that question about the co-authoring process, this is your second book, your first co-authored. This is a question from one of our book club participants. What roadblocks did you face while publishing the book, and what changed throughout that editing process, and once it kind of got to that point?
hmm So Abby and I, I should say Abby and I had never worked together before this book. So I interviewed quite a few writers, in the when we were looking for co-writers. And I had gotten the idea for the book, but I was very clear that I wanted and needed a co-writer, because it was 2018, because I knew that I personally couldn't disappear for 2.5 years to write a book, in the midst of an administration that was persecuting and attacking immigrants. Like, I needed to be able to do both things. I needed to be able to be an activist and be on the front lines, and I needed to be able to write this book. So in that process of meeting with writers, I met with Abby, and I really liked her, and we clicked right away. And so what we had to do is we had to write a book proposal. And so in order to get the book published, so what we did is a book proposal is we wrote the first 2 chapters of the book. And then we had a very detailed summary. It was like a 50-page document. And then our agent sent that book out to a bunch of different publishers, and we had like 5 meetings with some folks. And we talked with editors, and they asked us a lot of questions and what we were thinking and this, that, and the third. And we were very clear that this book was going to be unapologetically political, unapologetically pro-immigrant, unapologetically like about racial dynamics in the United States. We also were very clear that the book had to come out before the election. And that made some publishers a little bit uncomfortable, which was fine because we wanted to be very upfront with what we wanted and what was our desires. because we wanted the right partnership. And we found the right partnership with Putnam, and our editor, Stacy, she's extraordinary. We basically wrote like 3 drafts of the book. And between the first and the second draft, it's basically it's a totally different book. And she really was the one that was able to take our ideas and our intention and get it to a place of clarity, that made emotional sense, that made logistical sense, and really pushed us to get the final product of this book. So Stacy was instrumental in our process as well.
Yeah, it's funny publishing. We have one of our co-facilitators is a local writer, and was mentioning, and Word Up, we are a bookstore, and so we're following what's happening in the world, and these books, and just very funny how impactful and how thoughtful and how well researched and just put together this book was. And then also, um, and then also, and the same time, books like American Dirt coming out and getting sort of, it's like a little, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
That sort of thing came up. Oh, sorry. Veronica from in the chat says it's interesting to hear the process, especially since you didn't know each other before.
Yeah, like we basically had a one night stand and then we decided to get married. Like that's essentially what happened with our book, right? So we were very lucky, and we also are in the process of pitching our second book. So that is what we're trying to do as well. But it doesn't always turn out that way when you're collaborating. Like I mentioned, I've collaborated, I don't know, 15 different people, a lot of people. And there's only been one collaboration that really didn't work out. And that was really painful and really hard and really long process. But I would prefer taking that risk, because I think the process and the product is much better that way.
Yes, and then I think maybe you're reading the comment.
Yeah, I don't have my glasses on, so I have to bend down. Sorry.
Yeah, for people who aren't able to see the comment, but also sounds great that you knew you needed the time to write and be an activist, and so found a way to make that happen. I wonder if you can speak more about your activism, um, and then maybe we can weave in the kinds of. I always love to ask writers what they read, but your activism and also
Mm-hmm.
the other voices that you're listening to as part of that.
Yeah. So pre-Donald Trump, I was just a filmmaker and a mom. I had written another book called The Ones Who Don't Stay. It's also a novel, and it's not YA, it's adult, regular novel. That was super painful for me. It was really, really hard to do. Oh my gosh, it took me 2.5 years of basically by myself in coffee shops, and I hated the process. So I was also very clear that in order to write this book, like I had suffered so much through that first book that I was like, I can't do that again. There has to be another way. So all that to say is 2016 hits, and making movies is also a very slow process. You can work on one movie for 7 years, because of the business, because of a whole host of things. And the movies that I also make are very authentic and very dark and not Hollywood films, so they take even longer to make. And I knew in 2016, once he was elected, I couldn't continue in the same way. The world had changed enough for me to know that I needed to put filmmaking aside and really focus on protecting those that were most vulnerable, protecting my community. So that's when I started working for and with the Women's March, founded the Women's March. And those 10 weeks of planning and organizing the Women's March was a crash course in frontline activism. I had never been a frontline activist in the sense that all of my work is extraordinarily political, but I was an artist first and foremost, and my art was my way of organizing, was my weapon. And here I was in a very different role, but my skill set was still the same. All of the skills that I had as a filmmaker, as a producer, as a writer, as a director, they transferred over easily into rapid response organizing. And those skills were used in, I think, also in very different and creative ways, like working with seasoned activists and organizers, as well as then me coming in with another group of artists that weren't seasoned organizers, but we knew how to tell stories, we knew how to move people, we knew how to use social media, we knew how to galvanize groups of people. And with their organizing skills, it was like the perfect combination for the Women's March. And then once the Women's March ended, and the Women's March has its own complications, but the importance of the Women's March to set the tone for what the next 4 years would be like, it was very clear to me that my role was in that. And I went very soon after the Women's March back into organizing around immigration and for immigrants. But again, using my skill set, I don't call myself an organizer. I'm not the one that's out there organizing specifically for policy and going through the ins and outs of the political establishment. That is not my job. What I do is I organize people around stories. I organize people around feelings and emotions. I tell stories in order to get them to do the work that organizers are asking for them to do. And that role has been very eye-opening and very emotionally exhausting, very difficult, but also very rewarding, because we ultimately, not all of us, but a lot of us, most of us survived the last 4 years, and they were very difficult. And now we have the opportunity to, and the president was not my candidate of choice, but the circumstances that we have now really are giving us a path forward for the possibility of a lot of good things and a lot of positivity for our communities. And I'm very proud of all of the work that we did to make sure that we didn't have the next 4 years of our lives were not and are not going to be under the power of someone who I think is a very bad human being and very bad for this country. But as we all know, there's still so much work to do, and we are still not out of the woods and out of the clearing of fascism. Like, fascism is still very much at our backs.
Yeah, I often find that when people just say, "Oh, this is very timely," it kind of undercuts what's being said and what the message is. And I think, reading this now, and thank you for for keeping it present that no, we cannot now go to sleep.
No.
That's not, which is concerning rhetoric that does sometimes get passed around. So
I
yeah.
think everyone should rest. I think we should rest right now. Like, I think we all need to rest. We are also in a pandemic that so many people we've lost. We haven't been able to mourn those that have lost. We haven't been able to mourn the changing of all of our lives. We haven't been able to really truly talk about what it means to have been and to be a woman in the midst of this pandemic, and gender roles, and if you're a parent, what that means. And there's just a lot of things that we haven't been able to process for the past 4 years because it has just been nonstop, go, 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 go. And then we have this pandemic for the last year. So I think we need to rest. And I think we all don't need to rest. Some of us need to continue to do the work. Some of us need to rest. And when you feel rested, when you got your 12 hours sleep for a few days, then you need to get back into the game. But in a certain case, in a certain way, the real work is now, because for the past 4 years, we have been fighting, defense, stopping all the horror. And we did a decent job. Now the next 4 years, or really the next 2 years, because the next 2 years is when we are guaranteed, obviously, the Senate and the House. The next 2 years is when the real work begins, because now we're creating and envisioning and implementing the world that we want, which in some ways is even harder than just playing defense. So we got 2 years to really do important work. And books like Sanctuary and art that talks about these social ills and these moments are even more critical, because uh, we're still, like I said, we're still not out of the woods. We're still surrounded by the possibility of January 6th happening on a larger scale and them being actually more successful.
Yeah, just a shout out further in the chat about the timeline. I'm curious because I think that's the electoral side of activism, and that sort of focus is one side of things, and policy being a very present actor in Sanctuary.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of other stuff happening around it, and there's maybe um, a sort of voting based or election based sort of kind of hope to influence the political situation. But I'm wondering beyond that and the world that we create, because I think also when we're on this journey with Valley, and we're and there's also an incredible sense of urgency about the story, and and about this journey. Um, what also winning looks like, and what when you envision the world you want to
Mm.
live in, that looking a little bit bigger. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, and what does that look like, because I think we don't necessarily fully experience that in Sanctuary, but that
Mhm.
is also part of the work of, I think, storytellers. And
Mhm.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think that's a great question. And there are a lot of organized, like there's a lot of policy baked into the book that I hope is not didactic, but actually part of the story and interesting and emotionally engaging. And you hopefully don't even really notice that it's there. There are a lot of organizing principles also in the book in that sense as well, baked in, that I hope are not dogmatic, but rather just nuanced and emotionally resonant. And one of those is the end of the book. I'm assuming everyone's read the end of the book. I hope I'm not giving any spoilers away, but what I'll say without giving too much away is when she's at that final moment by herself, and she's looking back to where she just came from. She has a realization. We don't say the realization out loud, but I hope readers are able to interpret what it is, and that's based on this idea, this very clear idea that nobody is free until we are all free. And that's what Valley realizes at that moment, that she can't find freedom in California um, until all those in the other 49 are free along with her. And to me, that is the vision of the world that I want. And I know that that's a very lofty vision and a very big vision, but I believe in as an artist, that's my job. My job is to um, imagine a world that for other people might be unimaginable, right? My job is to um, allow and inspire people to love when the easy thing to do is to hate. And so I go for those big, bold, audacious ideas, and that is the world that I want Valley to live in. And I also um, recently really started to understand this idea and this concept, like on a visceral, deep, emotional level, about Afrofuturism and what that means, and why that style of ideation in art and literature is so important. And I realized that because in the past 4 years, and again, we all know this, but we have to say it, like, this did not just happen with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is just a symptom of a much, much larger, longer problem. But I will say in my lifetime, this is the worst of the worst. And specifically from an immigrant perspective, it is the worst of the worst. And so why I had this deep understanding, visceral level of understanding around Afrofuturism and its importance and what it meant and what it was saying was because these past 4 years have been so horrible and horrifying for immigrants. And then to say and to imagine and to demand and be bold that in Afrofuturism's case, Black people exist in the future, and not only do they exist, but they are thriving and living and loving and creating, and they are brilliant, and they are in this incredible, important, central space. That in of itself is a revolutionary thought. And I was like, oh shit, oh sorry, oh, like this is what it also means for immigrants too. Like, where is our Afrofuturism for immigrants, right? And it's not about co-opting, but it's about like understanding that really deep, important movement. That's also part of how I imagine the future to be, for Valley, as well as for immigrants in the future.
Rachel in the chat says, I really liked the ending of the book. Thank you for sharing your thought process behind it. I wonder, and now maybe we can talk a little bit about, who are some people who you think are envisioning that future? Who are some people, who are some of those, I mean, because I follow, I'm a big fan of Afrofuturism, and I grew up on Octavia Butler as like
Of
required
course, yeah.
reading in my household. And so her Earthseed series has, I think, been a beacon for a lot of people. But I wonder, who are some people who've done that sort of work, for immigrants, for undocumented folks, for the communities that you're working most closely with, that you would want other people also to be reading and imagining with,
Well, Octavia Butler influenced me tremendously as well. Parable of the Sower is incredible book, a painful book, a critical book. And I found Octavia Butler very late in life. I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but it just, she is not, unfortunately, taught to us in school, in high school, and even college, in theater. Like, I went to theater school, and even in that curriculum, she was not taught to me. And a lot of the authors that I love the most were not taught to me. One has to go out and find them. And so Octavia Butler came into my life probably in my late 20s, early 30s, very late, but she definitely is someone that was very important to me. I will say, just specifically with regards to Sanctuary, The Hunger Games was a big influence for me as well. And for Abby, we talked a lot about that book. And then magical realism, which is, the Latin American perspective of, maybe like even the parallel of Afrofuturism is magical realism for Latin America. And magical realism for me is so important because and I'm Colombian, so the godfather of magical realism obviously is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and so I have an affinity towards him, but and that genre. But what magical realism did in its moment in time was it allowed the madness of Latin America, across the board, across the continent, to be not explained, but critiqued in a way that talked about it from the people to, ultimately magical realism is a critique on society. It's a critique of the elite. And it is a way in which it's done that is very much the culture of who we are. The madness of Colombia, the historical madness of Colombia, in some ways can only be explained in magical realism, right? And so I take that idea and those elements in that way. A book that I'm reading right now, which I'm really interested, I've only just begun, I'm only like on page 85, but is the new book, The Prophet, which is, tell me, you're excited about it. Unmute yourself though, because you're muted.
Wait. Finish what you're going to say, because there are a couple. Is it the Robert?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm also reading that. Sorry.
Okay. Well, are you just beginning, or are you like?
I'm just beginning also, so I'm not. Spoil it though, because I'll read.
I'm not spoiling that. I'm just saying, like the the way in which it's broken down and what he's talking about is also like, it's very different. It's a different way in which to tell that story, to tell those stories, and the idea of, starting. And I haven't even gotten to the place of who they are, but the first chapter, it's basically God's speaking to the main character, to the reader, is my understanding of it anyways. And it's a very emotional, visceral, we're talking about the past, we're talking about slavery in that book, but I feel it's very futuristic in some ways too. And so I think that's kind of the elements that I'm attracted to. And with regards to Sanctuary is a very dark, authentic book. You all saw that. It's dark, it's hard to get through. But I hope that the hope shines through. And where we have a 3-book idea. We'll see if we get to those 3-book ideas. I want eventually that idea, that futurism, that magical realism, that Afrofuturism, that concept to be in that 3rd book, because I want that future to be how we imagine it to be. That was a very long-winded, not very clear way of answering your question.
That's interesting. Because Octavia was mentioned in the parable, but parable of the talents. It's a very interesting sort of thinking about your envisioning this like 3,
Mm-hmm.
this arc. After parable of the sower, some of that running kind of stops, and then we see what comes after that settlement. In a way, I'm trying not to spoil too much for people who haven't read this
Yes.
yet. Please read them. But I'm wondering, like, when we might see that, what, and also,
Yes.
and also what in the real world, because I feel like one of the other things very interesting about a lot of these Afrofuturist ideas, but also just a lot of fantasy and things that sometimes get called magical realism that might not get called magical realism if other people wrote it, or things that might be thought of in certain types of ways. A lot of that is pulled from real experience and from what we're looking at around us now. And if there's anything that's inspiring you to write those things that are existing now that maybe we can also know about and look to, and also when we'll be able to read the next installment.
Well, reading the next installment, we're hopefully going to be pitching within the next month or so to our publisher. So hopefully if that goes well, then, Abby and I tend to write fast. So hopefully within the next year or so, year and a half. Also, the book is in the process of being optioned into a film. So that's that. And obviously if it gets optioned, if we do get through the option to a film, then I think the second book becomes easier to write, because people are like, oh, movie, more money for the second book, that they'll make more money for the second book. So hopefully that all comes to pass. So there is that. And then, sorry, what was the second part of your question? It was a good one, but I don't remember.
What are you pulling from?
Oh yeah, what am I pulling from in reality right now? So I'm definitely pulling from the possibility, the optimism, the hope of these next 2 years, of what could possibly get done in these next 2 years. Like that is where my hope lies. But, and this is also what I'm pulling from, is, white supremacy in this country has always been and is currently very, very powerful. So we are at this crossroads. Where will we go as a country? So I think that is also where we will be pulling from as well. So while Valley has the possibility, opportunity, and like she's closest to the thing that she's wanted, almost maybe possibly ever in her life, there's also a very dark, powerful vacuum that is pulling her and sucking her out. So that will be that conflict that will be within Valley's story, and the conflict that I think that we're in the United States at this moment in time as well.
Wonderful. Well, we have about 10 more minutes left, and I'm wondering if we have any more questions from our participants, and and we're also streaming live on Facebook, and I don't know if we won't be able to get to those questions now. But if you have any more questions, thank you for your questions earlier, Alex, and anybody else. Um, you know, but while those are coming in, I'm just curious, like when it comes to just living at this current time as a writer, what that looks like for you. I think you were talking about resting earlier, and I think there's trying to come to a sense of equilibrium.
Mhm.
You're quite active and you do a lot of things, and it's like whenever we step outside, there's the plague. So there's also that. Oh, okay, we've got to. Oh, and then and so you're at home, and so this is a great question. How do you write with your kids? Hmm?
Mhm,
Hmm.
mhm. Great question. Well, the writing of this book took place pre-pandemic, so there's that reality. If I was writing a book right now, it would be 100 times harder than what it is to write. So if you are writing a book right now, I would say be gentle with yourself. This pandemic will not last forever, though it feels like it is. It will not last forever. And yet, so you will be able to write after the pandemic. So if your writing output is not what it was pre-pandemic, it's all good because that's normal because we're in a pandemic. So be gentle with yourself. You'll be able to write how you need to write once this pandemic is over. And for those of you that if you're able to write in the middle of a pandemic, that's amazing and extraordinary. And I'm so happy for you. But don't, you don't have to, we don't have to compare ourselves or our output to what other people are able to do. Oh, sorry, that's my little doggy. That's a pandemic puppy. He used to be, he's not so small anymore. He's pretty big now. But he was supposed to stay small and now he's a giant. We call him Apollo the giant. But so some tricks of the trade for kids. I have a 7-year-old. So I try to get him to be a writer too. And I do that for a whole host of reasons, but I also find like he will get into writing, um, for maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes, but that half an hour, 45 minutes is critical sometimes. So I think like encouraging that and like possibly like being like, okay, I'm going to sit down and write, you sit down and write. And then we share each other's work. So just engaging them in the process could give you some much needed few minutes. Obviously there's getting up earlier or going to sleep later, though I hate personally doing that. And I actually talk to my son a lot about my work and my writing and what it is about, though he can't read it, um, and ask him for his ideas, just to engage in that conversation with him. Um, so, so yeah, I don't have any secrets, but that's kind of just what I'm able to do.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. My niece is coming to visit me soon. She's 8, and we're gonna test that out on her.
Oh, yay! That's great. That's so good.
And we have a question from Rachel. Any advice or words of wisdom for young activists or writers?
Mm, absolutely. You know, to be both an activist, but to be an artist, to be a writer is hard. It's really hard to do that. So I think what you have to do is you have to find discipline and you have to be persistent. And you also have to find that story that keeps you up at night, that whether it's an issue, whether it's a person, that thing that is just inside of you, that it doesn't come hell or high water, you have to get it out. Because the other thing, writing takes time. If you're lucky, you could write a book in 2 years, a year and a half, if you're lucky. Many writers, 5, 7, 10 years to write one book. And so to really commit to the thing that you're writing has to be because you have to tell it, because you have to say it. Um, you know, I have been telling the stories of immigrants for 15 years. It is my life's work. It is my, and I was pretty even keeled tonight because normally I get real passionate and I can go on a tangent about immigration and immigrants for a very long time, because that is a thing that that is in my blood, quite literally, but also it is where I know I have to be. So find that, search for that. You and maybe it's not a theme like it is for me for immigration, but it is a story that has to live and breathe and be inside of you, and then get it out. And then the other thing, this is a very, very practical advice, but when I was writing my first book by myself, um, I had to contractually, I had to give a 70,000 word document to my editor. And that scared the daylights out of me. I was so scared of around 70,000 words. I was like, how am I going to do that? So what I did is I gave myself, excuse me, I gave myself a word count that I had to hit every day. And I had it a little sticky on my computer, and that was my word count every day. 1,500 words every day, 1,000 words every day, like whatever the word count needed to be. And I couldn't go back and edit anything until I had completed that word count. If it took me 2 hours, then I was done in 2 hours. If it took me 8 hours that day to do that word count, then that's what it took. And that discipline, what I realized was very much, writing is a discipline, writing is a muscle. Where it was so painful to write 1,000 words at the beginning, by the end, writing 1,000 words was, I could do it. It was 2,000 words, like I could just get it out. And so that little trick for me was really, really helpful.
That's great advice. Thank you. Um, what you said about the story that keeps you up at night, and it being something in your blood was very interesting, because it reminded me of Shuri Moraga's memoir, Native Country of the Heart, where she
Mm,
talks about how a lot of the work of activism is about returning home in some way, regardless of whether or not you're physically returning home, but it having some space there, and um,
mm,
whatever that looks like, right? And so
mhm.
it's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for supporting a local bookstore. That's so important. And thank you for all that you all are doing. I know it's not easy, and I'm going to post your GoFundMe link.
Oh,
Thank
thanks.
you for sharing. No, we need you, and we need you all out there, especially Washington Heights. So thank you.
Well, we're coming up with a new program, where we're going to try and have some intergenerational book clubs. So maybe that's a space to get you and Abby to come.
Absolutely. We will be there, and hopefully it'll be in person this time next year, in person, this time 6 months in person, this time next month. Whenever it is, not next month, but whenever it is, we will be there in person or virtually. Absolutely.
All right, fabulous. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. And this video will be posted onto YouTube at some point. I think we'll double check with you, Paola, and everything, and about all that. So yeah, well, take care.
Bye, everyone. Stay healthy.
Yep. All righty.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.